Well, let's see what we can do for the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. We are going through a red letter study, and we're finishing up the Sermon on the Mount. We're getting real close. We're two-thirds of the way through chapter 7, which is the final chapter of the sermon, 5, 6, and 7. To get into the target verse today, I don't know, for some of you who were here a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the electron cloud, and some of you remember that. And what I see happening, and what I love that I see happening, is that as science goes further and further into the very small and the very large, they're banging up right against God's stuff. And what's happening is there is a connection, a nexus that is forming between spirituality and science in a way that, certainly a few generations ago, we never thought it was possible. They seem to be going the opposite direction. But as we get into the particles and we get into the universe, we're realizing there's stuff that we can't explain. And the stuff that we can explain, we explain it by not explaining it. It's just a paradox, like the electron cloud. I wanted to hit you with another scientific term today to introduce what we're talking about. And the word of the day, wasn't that Groucho used to say the magic word, win $100? But you're not going to win anything except my undying respect if you know what the word albedo means. Not to be confused with libido. This is albedo. No. Oh, this is great. This is great. Albedo comes from the Latin word for white, so it's the same root word that we get albino from, right? Albedo. What it refers to is the ability of something to reflect sunlight. So albedo, the albedo effect, would be the total reflectivity of a body under the sun. And it's measured from 0 to 1. Yeah, they didn't mess around, right? Basically binary, 0 and 1. So that a completely black body that reflected none of the sun's light would be 0, and then something that reflected every bit of the sun's rays would be a 1. Now, on the face of the earth, on the surface of the earth, there's nothing that's a perfect 0 or 1. Some things come fairly close. Freshly poured asphalt, right, is 0.04. So that's 0.04 of the total reflectivity of an albedo effect. And fresh snow is 0.9, 9/10. And so you can see the difference between the two, black and white. The average albedo for the entire Earth is about 0.3. So you can kind of see where we are. Now, if you think about it, the amount of sunlight that the Earth reflects has huge impact on climate. And we talk about climate all the time, mostly in relation to what, is going into the atmosphere. But the ability to reflect light also has a huge impact on climate. If you think about the ice ages where, 2/3 of the landmass was covered with white snow, right? Glaciers, that creates a runaway albedo effect because the colder it gets, the more snow, then the more sunlight's reflected, the colder it gets again, and it's kind of like a greenhouse effect in reverse. On the other hand, if you had what we sometimes call a nuclear winter, which that may be something a little different, but it is suspected that some of the supervolcano explosions would end the ice ages. In fact, 12,000 years ago, when the last ice age ended, it is surmised that it was probably a supervolcano explosion, that as the volcano spewed all the material out into the atmosphere, basically the Earth was covered with ash. Well, ash is a lot more albedo than, right? A lot lower albedo than snow would be. And so the Earth started to heat up and the snow started melting, and then you had a runaway effect in the other direction. So albedo has a huge effect on climate. How much are we affecting albedo? Well, urbanization creates a much higher albedo and lower albedo. So more heat is being trapped in urban areas. And we've been talking about ways to try to increase that. Do you remember those Greek houses? You remember the Greek houses that you see that are built into the cliffs and the hillside? In fact, there's a picture of one such neighborhood on your inserts where it's all just pure white. I always loved the look of those houses, but that's done for an effect, right? Because that high albedo with the white color is reflecting the sun's light so that the houses are cooler themselves. Now, why am I telling you all this about albedo? The reason is that by the time Jesus comes on the scene, in the first century in Judea. The Jews had basically become a legalistic system of religion and basically a legalistic society. They were all about performance. They were all about performance under the law. In fact, they understood that they were God's chosen people because, first of all, their ethnicity, but also because of their law and because of their ritual practice. Those three things together locked them down as God's chosen. And it's interesting that John the Baptist, starting right in Matthew 3, where he's talking about John the Baptist's ministry, when he sees the Pharisees and the scribes coming into where he's baptizing the people, he says, "You brood of vipers." Mince no words there. Who told you to come here? Because he basically says, you think that you're sons of Abraham and you think that's going to do it for you? In other words, your ethnicity, right? He says, God could raise these stones up to be children of Abraham. In other words, it's not about your ethnicity. It's not about law, Jesus tells us. It's not about ritual practice. What does Jesus say? You go to the altar to perform your sacrifice and remember that you have something against your brother. Leave the sacrifice at the altar and go fix the relationship. Because otherwise the sacrifice means nothing. What Jesus is trying to do is to rescue his people from the legalism and the literalism of the Pharisees and the scribes that had become the Jewish system over the last 2 to 3 centuries before Jesus comes on the scene. This is a long time coming. And so, as we've said before, in the Sermon on the Mount, he spends pretty much most of chapter 5 in Matthew trying to redefine the law. The law isn't the absolute instrument that is going to prove your acceptability to God if you just follow the rules. And he breaks that down. He says it's a condition of your heart. It's not just following the code. And in Matthew 6, the next chapter, he redefines righteousness in exactly the same way. The Pharisees and the scribes had delineated that almsgiving and fasting and prayer were the 3 marks of a righteous person. And they had all these rules and ways that it needed to be done. And of course, they used it for their own aggrandizement. And Jesus breaks that down too. He says, it's not what you give. It's not what you do here. It's the condition of your heart. Is your desire to do these things flowing outward from a transformed heart, or are you just following rules? Are you trying to look good? And here in chapter 7, he gets into discerning the way. What does the true way look like? And how can you tell the difference between a false way that is leading nowhere and this true way that he's trying to get across to us? At the top of the chapter, he tells us not to judge. But all through the next few sections, he's telling us that we need to be able to discern. And we talked about judgment as being a conclusion that we draw based on some set standard. But discernment is a conclusion we draw based on experience. As we experience whether these systems, whether these ways, what we're doing religiously and spiritually, are they really bringing any life? Or are they taking it away? So it's all about discerning this way, learning to see what gives life, what nurtures spiritual life, and what does not, and what actually goes the other direction and takes it away. And so last week, Jesus was asking about the false prophet. It wasn't asking, he was telling us about the false prophet and to know what the false prophet was. He said we would know the quality of a prophet. We would know the quality of any person that we meet or dealing with by their fruit. And he uses that analogy of the fruit because he says like breeds like. You're not going to get figs from a thorn bush, right? And so what is the fruit of this person that you're trying to discern? Especially if they are a teacher, especially if they're a prophet who is teaching you. Is what they are teaching you something that is really going to take you where you want to go or not? Because it's not about simple belief. It's not about what we agree to believe in our minds. It's not about our pedigree. It's not about our ethnicity. It's not that, we were born Presbyterian and we're going to die Presbyterian and that's the one way to heaven. It's not about pedigree. And it's not about performance. Especially not legally. It's not about performance. So what is this fruit that Jesus is talking about? If you will know this person, if you will know this prophet by the fruit, what is the fruit if it's not those things that we have been taught so many times over and over again. Well, I want to propose to you that the fruit that Jesus is talking about is actually spiritual albedo. A spiritual albedo. If you take this analogy and run with it a little bit, if you think of God as the sun, this spiritual albedo measures our ability to reflect God, our ability to reflect who God really is. And who is God? Well, God is love. But in order for God to be love, God has to be unity first, has to be oneness first. Because love really is identification with the other, with the beloved. And so this unity effect, being able to see how reflective we are of God's unity, this spiritual albedo, I believe is the fruit that Jesus is talking about. Now, he's going to drive this point deeper, and let's go ahead and read the target verse at Matthew 7, starting at verse 21. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" So first of all, what Jesus is saying basically is it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? It's not what you believe. It's not what you declare that you believe. It's not what you obey. It's not what you build. And it's not what you perform or accomplish. It's about who you know. Because such beliefs and such performance are not the same as knowing, as intimacy, as we'll talk about later when we talk about knowing in the Jewish sense of that word. So let's break it down a little bit here. First of all, when is all this happening? Jesus says, on that day. So what day is he talking about on that day? Well, if you read commentaries, and I've read a few commentaries, they will basically all tell you that that day is the final judgment day. Now, some will say maybe it's the day of your own death, but it's projected out there. And usually, without a doubt, the hands-down favorite is we're talking about Judgment Day, the final judgment of everything. And that's the usual interpretation. But I want you to remember that everything is being said here by Jesus in the context of kingdom. And so very humbly here, I want to disagree with all those commentaries. Probably not too surprising. And you can decide whether you want to agree with me or not. But let me give you a few parameters here and why I think that they got it wrong. Everything that Jesus talks about is always in the context of kingdom. And if you understand what he means by kingdom in that first century language, in the context of their worldview, the kingdom is here now. The kingdom is not heaven of the next life. Kingdom wasn't when a warrior king came and kicked out the Romans and established a new sovereign Israel. That's not the kingdom. But the contemporaries of Jesus thought of kingdom in that way. We think of kingdom in terms of heaven of the next life. Neither one of us are nailed down to what Jesus is trying to teach us about kingdom, which is the quality of life that we can live right here and now. When we are aware, when we are present, when we have stepped outside of all of the workings of our egoic mind and all the traumas that cover over our ability to be present, and we can just be here now and see each other as the connected people that we are and choose accordingly. Choose what love really requires in the moment rather than blindly trying to follow rules or just blowing up relationships. That's kingdom. But it's kingdom right here and right now. So if he's talking about on that day, what day is he talking about? I think he's talking about just the previous verse. It's going to be on that day that the person calls out, Lord, Lord. That seems so simple to me. Because Jesus is always putting in therefores and so's and fors that refer back to the previous verse. I think he's doing the same thing here. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And they will say to me on that day, that they call out. Calling out. Why are they calling out, Lord, Lord? Well, it's an attempt to justify themselves, right? It's an attempt to try to see themselves as worthy of, because they have drunk the Kool-Aid that their performance matters, and they did all these great things in his name. Therefore, they're entitled to something, trying to justify. I remember, gosh, it's getting to be a long time ago, 30 plus years. I was in my early 40s. We were living in Dana Point, and I had spent the last 10 years trying to get these concepts under my fingernails, studying as a pastoral candidate and studying Christian origins and trying to understand what all of this meant, because it made no sense to me. And after 10 years, I had a lot of head knowledge. I was already teaching some of this stuff, in our local church, our church body. Sometimes much to the chagrin of the leadership, but I was doing it anyway. But what I knew deep down in my heart is that I wasn't changing yet. I was still just as neurotic as I was 10 years ago. I was still struggling with the same things. I still had the same things spinning around in my head. And I was sitting out in our back deck at night, and I was doing exactly this. I was calling out, Lord, Lord. Look at all these things that I've done. Hey, I'm leadership in church. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. And yet, deep down, I knew that something was missing. That was that day. Trying to justify myself before God. Trying to make myself feel better was what I was trying to do. And that was also the moment that I finally feel like I had that apostrophe, that epiphany, and broke through. And I finally heard, not in words, but in a way that just brought it home, that if God's love is perfect, then God can't love me anymore, and God can't love me any less. And that sounds so simplistic, but it came to me with a clarity that I hadn't gotten in 10 years. And that began the process of changing, and that's been going on ever since. Have you had moments like that? Not necessarily with the epiphany, but at least where you're trying to justify yourself. You've been working so hard, right? You've been trying to get all this stuff, and it just seems like it's sand through your fingers. And Lord, what's going on? I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And your prayer is, why isn't this making a difference? I've heard so many people tell me that they've had that. That's their day. The day that they're trying to justify. The day that they're talking to God because they're feeling entitled to something more than they're getting. Because they've worked so hard, because they've sacrificed so much, because they've done so much. And I think that's the day that Jesus is talking about. It's a day that we begin to discern the difference between following rules and following a path that is laid out for us and doing something that comes from the inside out organically. But I think that's the day that we start to understand what really brings life and what does not. And so on that day is every day. It's any day. It's this day. It's right now. And it always is. That day is always now. Always this day. Because everything that Jesus talks about and teaches is this day, now. There's an immediacy to it. Not necessarily an urgency in his timing, but there is an immediacy to it. And so with that context in mind, what is Jesus trying to tell us here in this little passage? Well, if you go back to verse 21, the very first verse, he's basically saying it's not what you say you believe. It's not what you think you believe that makes any real difference here in terms of bringing this life, bringing this kingdom. Because everything is about entrance to kingdom, really about becoming kingdom, right? And it's not a profession of faith. It's not about your loyalty. It's not about even adherence to principles or rules or doctrine. None of that is really what this is all about. Now, I'm sure some of you must have Romans 10 banging around in your brain by now, right? And if you think about it, starting at verse 7, this is where Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Doesn't that go completely contrary to what I just talked about? See, I don't think so. We've talked in here a lot about sacraments. Whenever we baptize someone, whenever we've ordained someone, whenever we do anything, we make sure that everybody understands what a sacrament is. A sacrament is an outward expression of an inward transformation. The outward expression is a ritual. It means absolutely nothing in itself, but it means everything to the transformed heart that is expressing itself in community through that ritual. We sanctify the sacrament. The sacrament does not sanctify us. We got it backwards. Professing Jesus as your mouth may be an informal sacrament, but it's still a sacrament. It's still an outward expression of an inward transformation. If we don't have the inward transformation, nothing is taking place. So even as Paul says this, it's not somehow magically or superstitiously if you proclaim Jesus by mouth and if you agree to believe mentally that he's not dead, that he's still relevant, that he's still alive, that he's still part of this and part of everything and part of our lives, that automatically you're going to be saved. And of course, now what do we mean by saved? Because we mean that God will finally accept us and let us into heaven and we can avoid hell. But to a Jew, salvation is spiritual liberation here and now. You got to understand, if it's coming from a Jewish perspective, it's here and now. We're always delaying things, but Jews are about here and now. And our scriptures are written by Jews. Salvation is liberation here and now. And that's the liberation from fear. If we really are transformed enough so that it flows out of us, that we have now the sense of submission and dependence to Jesus as Lord, to our Father in heaven as Lord, if we completely are convinced to our bones that Jesus did not die on the cross, or at least he didn't stay dead, that he is still alive, he is still relevant, he is still active in our lives, then we can become free of the fear that death has over us. That is salvation from a Jewish perspective. The freedom from that fear. The ability to live your life in such a way that you can afford to be vulnerable, that you can afford to show everybody who you are, that you can afford to let your resources flow through you. You don't have to hoard them. You don't have to dam everything up. You can let your defenses down. That is salvation. And I believe that's what Paul is talking about. So those two passages, I don't believe contradict themselves in any way. Actually, I think that they reinforce each other as they go. And so it's not about your profession of faith. It's about doing the will of the Father. And then we get that all back to front because we think the will means we're supposed to obey again, obey what God wants us to do, obey the rules, obey the laws. But the will, tsebiana, in Aramaic, means the pleasure, the deepest desire and delight and purpose of the Father. When God's deepest desire and delight becomes our deepest desire and delight, then we will automatically do the will of the Father without even thinking about it. That's what Jesus is talking about doing the will. He says it of himself, I and the Father are one. I don't do anything of my own initiative. I only do what the Father does through me. It's the how of God. How God lives and operates, not the what, as we think of all the things that we need to do the will of God. We do the will of God by entering into the how of God, the deepest delight and desire, which of course is unity, is oneness, is love. At verse 22, the Father's will, as we talked about, isn't this what? It's not about spectacular deeds. It's not about prophecy or casting out demons or even doing miracles. Man, if any of us could do that, we would think that we're in, right? And we'd gather crowds to beat the band and be able to make all sorts of dough because we are making miracles. And yet, that has nothing to do with what Jesus is talking about. It's not about these spectacular deeds. The deeds and the words, once again, in themselves mean nothing, just like a sacrament, just like a ritual. They're outward forms that don't bring the life that Jesus is talking about, and we need to be able to discern the difference. Only true intimacy can unite us with each other, with God. It's all about spending time together over long periods of time that create that intimacy, to create that oneness, create that connection. Nothing else will do. And it's not just about spending time. Sometimes you can spend decades with coworkers and you never really know them much better than you did the first time you met them, because you're not really open to them. You're not letting them in. You're not dropping your defenses. You're not becoming vulnerable with them. And so this knowing God, yada, which means intimate familiarity, comes at the expense of becoming vulnerable enough to let people actually in and seeing if they will return the favor. Now you know somebody, and not just their characteristics. Only true intimacy can unite us in this way. So when God says, "Depart from me, all you who practice lawlessness." Now that sounds, again, like the final judgment, right? Sounds like damnation. But that's our mindset talking again, where we're coming from when we hear these sayings, these phrases, these words. We have different definitions, different understandings of them. Actually, if you notice, if you look at the print, "Depart from me, all you who practice lawlessness," is all in capital letters, right? In the New Testament, anytime you see all capitals, it's a quotation from the Old Testament. That's how they clue you in. That is a direct quote from the Old Testament. Here it happens to be Psalm 6, verse 8. And this is David. He's grieving over the trauma that he has endured at the hands of his enemies. And he's praying to God for release and for deliverance. Everyone who has wronged him, those lawless ones, as he would see them, are the ones that he is praying to God to be relieved from. But at the end of that, it's a very short psalm. At the end of it, the moment that he regains his trust in God, the moment that he regains his belief that God has heard his prayer, he says, collectively, I suppose rhetorically, to all those enemies of his, "Depart from me, all of you who practice iniquity, all of you who have done harm to me." "Depart from me," though, has nothing that David has power over. He knows that he has reunited himself with God. He has reconnected with God in his prayer. And so it's kind of like the way cockroaches scatter the moment you turn the lights on. Because they're afraid of the light. And they run, they scatter. They're fearful in that presence. That's more what David is talking about. "Depart from me, scatter, because now God's light is shining here in this place. This is now holy ground, if you will." So they're scattering on their own. It's nothing that David does or could do to get them to depart. He knows that they will, because now he is reconnected to his God. And even those who practice lawlessness, the first time that I looked that up in an Aramaic lexicon, I thought I had the wrong entry, So I go to the word in the linear translation, and I take it into the lexicon, and the first definition is a child or a suckling infant. Oh, what the heck? I'm looking up lawlessness. So what mistake did I make? I realized, no, it's the right word. And then I scroll down to the next entry, and it's a colt, or a young horse, obviously. And then a little bit further down, there is lawlessness. So what's going on here? I had to learn this. These words in Ula means child, Ila means colt, and Allah means iniquity. They are all just variations of the same root word. And make no mistake, the translation here needs to be lawlessness or iniquity, and not a child or a suckling infant or a colt. But what it gives you is an insight into the Hebrew mind, the way they think. If all those words are related by the same root, what are we really saying? We're saying those who practice lawlessness are simply unformed, right? They're immature. They're not ready. They are unripe. Just like when we talked about good and evil, Taba and Bisha, not being the kind of legal good and evil that we normally think of as being completely separate and diametrically opposed, but they mean ripe and unripe. Same idea here. There's a continuum between unripe and ripeness, between iniquity or bad and good and righteousness. And somebody, and every one of us is on that spectrum, on that continuum someplace. And so this is the idea here. Those who are practicing the iniquity, they are scattering on their own because they are not yet ready. God isn't sending them away. This depart from me doesn't mean you got to go and I'm kicking you out and I'm throwing away the key. It is the people's own inability to connect, to do the will of God, to enter into and become that deepest purpose, to enter kingdom itself. In other words, they're already separated and they don't even know it. They think all the things that they're doing is what is going to gain God's approval, and Jesus is trying to instruct us it doesn't work that way. It can't work that way. It won't work that way. And not only that, this workers of iniquity or workers of lawlessness is not a permanent condition. They're immature. They're unformed. It's up to them, but they're just unripe. And they can move out of that position. They're unripe now. They're not ready. Not yet. But God is always ready and waiting for them when they are. But a corner has to be turned. You got to get out of the vehicle that is not taking you where you need to go. You have to get off the broad path and get on the narrow path. All these metaphors, all of this imagery that Jesus is throwing at us one after another, hoping that the light goes on someplace in us, that we understand what he's trying to say. Jesus is talking about integrity, of course, about being just one thing inside and out and not all these competing things. Saying that we're all about love and then practicing fear, living in fear. Can we be one thing? Jesus' harshest words are for the hypocrites, those who are two-faced. You know, the word hypocrite comes from the mask that was worn by the Greek actors, you know, tragedy and comedy and so on and so forth. They would wear masks, literally, when they did their stage plays. That's the word that is applied to people who wear a mask, right? And he has his harshest words for them. I'm just going to read a little bit of Matthew 23. These are the 7 woes. I'm not going to read all 7 to you. But listen how Jesus talks about the scribes and the Pharisees that he sees as being these two-faced people. And the harshest words are always for the teachers, always for the leaders, because they're the ones that are not only keeping themselves away from God's presence, but they're blocking all the people from getting there as well. Matthew 23, starting at verse 13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. And he goes on and on and on. Harsh language. But he knows these men are so far off the beam. Some of them are completely corrupted. Others are sincere. They really believe that this is the way that the people need to be, that they need to be in order to be united with God. But they are so far off the beam that they can never, ever, ever enter the kingdom They can't do it because they are ensconced inside that egoic apparatus. They are ensconced inside rule following and obedience and performance and all of that. And the only way, I don't know that if he believes he can reach them, although he did reach Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They're the ones who did turn around. But he needs the people to understand that they cannot see them as their guides if they are ever able to enter the kingdom. The truth of the matter is there's very few hypocrites among us. We use that word far too liberally and often. Because a hypocrite has to know what he or she is doing, that they believe one thing and they're acting another for their own advancement or for greater power or whatever it is that they are trying to, whatever outcome they're going for. Most of us are simply misinformed. Or maybe we're undiscerning. Or maybe we're simply just unripe. We can't do the things that we want to do, but we believe in the things that we're trying to do. Always get back to Paul. What a miserable man I am. All the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do, I do. That describes the human condition. There are hypocrites, but not as many as you would think. And then James chimes in, and you got to love James, Jesus' brother, his actual brother, at least traditionally. If you look at James 2, verse 14, and this is in your handouts, and also I'm sure Alex has got it up already. He says, "What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warm and filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works.' You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead." Now, just to understand this a little better, I want to read it again in the Message paraphrase, because I think he does a pretty good job in this passage of putting it together. I don't know if, Alex, you can get that up on the screen, but it's in your handouts, so you can follow along there. Here's Eugene Peterson's take on the same passage. He says, "Dear friends, do you think you'll get anywhere in this life? Do you think you'll get anywhere in this if you learn all the right words but never do anything? Does merely talking about faith indicate that a person really has it? For instance, you come upon an old friend dressed in rags and half-starved and say, 'Good morning, friend. Be clothed in Christ. Be filled with the Holy Spirit,' and walk off without providing so much as a coat or a cup of soup. Where does that get you? Isn't it obvious that God talk without God acts is outrageous nonsense? I can already hear one of you agreeing by saying, 'Sounds good. You take care of the faith department, I'll handle the works department.' Not so fast. You can no more show me your works apart from your faith than I can show you my faith apart from my works. Faith and works, works and faith fit together hand in glove. Do I hear you professing to believe in the one and only God, but then observe you complacently sitting back as if you had done something wonderful? That's just great. Demons do that. But what good does it do them? Use your heads. Do you suppose for a minute that you can cut faith and works in two and not end up with a corpse on your hands? The very moment you separate body and spirit, you end up with a corpse. Separate faith and works, and you get the same thing, a corpse. Hopefully that really brings it home. But as we read James, it sounds like he's coming right back to performance, doesn't it? And this is the problem that we have. We read Jesus. He seems to be saying one thing. We read Paul. seems to be saying something else. James seems to be saying something else. Where the heck is all this? But it has to do with our mindset. It has to do with the way that we read and interpret. We do not do works to prove our faith. We do not do our works to gain God's acceptance, of course, because it's a free gift. When faith graduates to trust, that's when we're liberated from fear. And that's when we can realize perfect love. Then our actions and our performance will simply flow. We won't be able to help it. We will have become God's will. James calls it the law of liberty. Not a law that restricts any longer, but a law that reflects the fullness of who we have become. How do we become this one thing, integrated inside and out? Well, Jesus calls it knowing God. How do we do that? Well, we do that by practicing one thing, God's will. That how of unity, that how of oneness, of presence. It's what and who God is. The more that we flow into that, the more that we practice contemplatively or any other way where we get outside ourselves and just be, we are practicing that one thing. We are coming more and more in contact with God, knowing God. This unity of thought and deed is starting to grow in us so that how we act is the same and flows from what we say we believe. There's no difference between them inside and out. And this requires awareness. This requires presence. It requires us to be fully connected in the moment with everyone who shares the moment with us so that we can choose what love requires in the moment and not just follow rules and think that one size fits all in every situation. How do we know if we're practicing the one thing? How do we know if we're really practicing and following the will of God? With our spiritual albedo. That's how we can know. We can use that, just like we can use it to spot the false prophet, to know whether the person that is teaching us or talking to us leads to life or not. We can do it for ourselves as well. The total reflectivity of God's unity in our lives can tell us whether we're on the right path. How are we going to know otherwise? Some of this stuff looks so good on paper, and we follow it. But what is it yielding? What is the fruit? It's the spiritual albedo. Do we leave people better than we found them? Or do we leave a trail of wreckage in our wake, like Mr. Magoo, not even aware of what it is that we're doing? Do we leave people better than we found them? Are our closest relationships, not the ones that we can gain, not the ones that we can project upon, but those whose toothbrushes hang side by side with ours, are those closest relationships intimate? Are they connected? Are they functional? That's how we can tell where we are in terms of our spiritual albedo. Is our fruit, is our reflection of God's light visible to us, to others? Is there an effect of God's love on our lives? So when we ask, what is knowing God? Obviously, we are going to say from a contemplative place that it's letting go of self, it's letting go of ego, which is what Jesus is saying over and over and over again. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to let go of ourselves often enough and long enough to experience the real reality of God's presence around us? I put a little blip in the handouts that I wrote some time ago about knowing God. See if this does anything for you. Take what you need, leave the rest. To know God is to know truth. To know truth is to trust God. To trust God is to be set free. And to be set free is to fear not. To fear not is to feel perfect love. To feel perfect love is to enter kingdom. And to enter kingdom is to know God. It's a circle, a circular journey that's always coming back to where we started, always coming back to right here and right now, always coming back home. Because the only home that we will ever have is here and now. The only place that we will ever experience God's presence. God, truth, liberty, perfect love, kingdom, it's all the same. It's all God, all expressions for the same thing. If we experience these, God, truth, liberty, love, kingdom. We are knowing God. That's how it works. And one thing more, consider, what is it that you do? Why do you do it? You know, do you like running? Do you like riding? Do you like fishing? Why? Why do you run? Is it for fitness? Why do you write? Is it for a grade, to be published, to be known? You know, why do you fish? Because you want food or you want a big trophy on the wall? When we do things for obligation or for outcome, we have changed the nature of the activity itself. Can we just run because we love to run? We love the feel of it. We love what it does in the moment of doing it. Can we just write because we love writing and fish because we love the sea? Does it have to be about an obligation? Does it have to be about an outcome? Or can it just be because you love it and you can't imagine not having that in your life? To graduate from obedience and obligation and reward is to simply know God in those moments where everything connects and everything comes together and you know that you've entered kingdom. Let's pray. Father, we pray for your guidance and for your help in this. It is difficult. Just in talking this morning, the difficulty of parsing through this when everything seems to be such a contradiction, when everything that we've been taught our entire lives are still being taught, hearing all these voices saying something different. What is the way to your life? What is the way that allows us to completely be present to you? That's what we want. Help us to find that. Help us to find you by being willing to let ourselves go and in the moment make the discernment and the distinctions that we need to make, trusting that you will always be there. And that if we're willing to move into presence, we will find you and we won't be led astray. Thank you for this kind of love and guidance and attention, Lord. Never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.